It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Pinewood Hills. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where houses sat close together, and kids rode bikes up and down the street. Everyone waved at each other and smiled. People thought they knew everything about everyone here, or at least, that's what they liked to believe. But today was going to shake things up big time. Let me tell you about Jake Carter. Jake was a guy who lived in a little white house with a red door. He wasn't the kind of person who made a lot of noise or showed off. Nope, not Jake. He didn't have a fancy car or a loud voice. He didn't throw big parties or blast music. He was just Jake. A regular guy. He liked things simple. He had short brown hair, wore plain t-shirts, and always kept his small yard neat. His driveway? Oh, he loved that driveway. It was smooth and clean, and he worked hard to keep it that way. He'd sweep it every weekend, making sure no leaves or dirt messed it up. To Jake, that driveway was his little piece of the world. But here's the cool part: Jake had a secret. A big one. Nobody in Pinewood Hills had any clue about it. Not his neighbors, not the mailman, not even the nosy old lady who peeked out her window all day. Jake kept it hidden, tucked away like a treasure chest buried under the ground. And that secret? It was about to change everything. But we're not there yet. First, we've got to talk about how this whole crazy story started. And it all began with one super annoying problem: a neighbor named Karen. Karen wasn't like Jake. Oh no. She was loud. She was bossy. She walked around Pinewood Hills like she was the queen of everything. Her house was bigger than Jake's, with fancy flowers in the front and a shiny red SUV parked out front. Karen had blonde hair she flipped all the time, and she wore big sunglasses even when it wasn't sunny. She was the boss of the homeowners association. People called it the HOA for short. The HOA made rules for the neighborhood, like how tall your grass could grow or what color your mailbox could be. Karen loved being in charge. She loved telling people what to do. And most of all, she loved acting like everyone else was smaller than her. Jake didn't care much about Karen at first. He saw her bossing people around, but he just shrugged and went on with his day. Live and let live, right? That was Jake's way. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't the kind of guy to pick a fight. He'd rather sit on his porch with a glass of lemonade and watch the birds than argue with anybody. But trouble? Trouble has a funny way of finding you, even when you don't want it. And that's exactly what happened on that sunny Saturday morning. It started like any other day. Jake woke up early. The sun was shining through his window, making little yellow squares on his floor. He yawned, stretched, and got out of bed. He put on his favorite blue t-shirt and some old sneakers. Then he made a peanut butter sandwich for breakfast. Jake loved peanut butter. He ate it slowly, looking out his kitchen window at his nice, clean driveway. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt right. He smiled to himself, thinking about sweeping the driveway later. Maybe he'd even wash his little gray car. It was going to be a good day. Or so he thought. Then he heard it. A loud rumble. A car engine. Jake peeked out the window, and his jaw dropped. There, right in the middle of his driveway, was Karen's big, shiny red SUV. It wasn't parked nicely off to the side. Nope. It was smack dab in the center, taking up the whole space. Jake's gray car was stuck behind it, trapped in the garage. He couldn't believe his eyes. Who parks in someone else's driveway? Who does that? Jake rubbed his eyes, thinking maybe he was still dreaming. But no, it was real. Karen's SUV was sitting there like it owned the place. He put down his sandwich and stepped outside. The sun felt warm on his face, but his stomach felt tight. He walked over to the driveway and stared at the big red car. It looked so out of place. His driveway was small, just big enough for his one car. Now it was blocked. Completely blocked. He looked around. Where was Karen? Then he saw her. She was across the street, talking to another neighbor. She was waving her arms and laughing, her big sunglasses bouncing on her nose. Jake took a deep breath. Okay, he thought. Maybe she just parked here by mistake. Maybe she didn't mean it. He'd just ask her nicely to move. That's all. No big deal. So Jake walked over. His sneakers squeaked on the pavement. Karen didn't notice him at first. She was too busy talking loudly about some new rule she wanted to make, something about no skateboards allowed. Jake waited until she stopped for a second. Then he said, hi, Karen. She turned and looked at him. Her sunglasses slid down her nose a little. What? She said, like he was bothering her. Jake pointed at his driveway. Your car, it's in my spot. Could you move it, please? Karen stared at him. Then she laughed. A big, loud laugh, like Jake had just told the funniest joke in the world. Oh, Jake, she said, shaking her head. This is a community. We share things here. Don't be so selfish. Selfish? Jake blinked. He didn't know what to say. His driveway wasn't a community parking lot. It was his. He paid for it. He took care of it. But Karen didn't care. She waved her hand like he was a fly buzzing around her head. Relax, she said. I'll move it later. I'm busy right now. Then she turned back to the other neighbor and kept talking, like Jake wasn't even there. Jake stood there for a second. His face felt hot. He wasn't mad yet, not really. He was just confused. Why would she do this? Why would she laugh at him? He looked back at his driveway. That big red SUV sat there, shiny and smug, like it was mocking him. He could feel his heart beating a little faster. This wasn't right. This wasn't fair. He walked back to his house slowly. His good morning was gone. No more peanut butter sandwich. No more sweeping the driveway. All he could think about was Karen and her car. He sat on his porch and stared at it. The more he looked, the more annoyed he got. But Jake didn't yell. He didn't stomp over and bang on her door. Nope. That wasn't Jake. He just sat there, quiet as ever. Thinking. And that's when it hit him. That secret he'd been keeping? That thing nobody knew about? Maybe it was time to use it? Maybe it was time to stop being so quiet. Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd just woken something up in Jake. Something big. Something that was going to turn Pinewood Hills upside down. But what was his secret? How could a regular guy like Jake take on a bossy queen like Karen? You'll have to keep reading to find out. Because this story? It's just getting started. Now, tell me in the comments, has anyone ever parked in your spot? What would you do? Would you let it go, or would you fight back? Let's hear it. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. Oh no. She was way more than that. She was the queen of the Homeowners Association, HOA for short. The HOA was a group that made rules for the neighborhood. Rules like no loud music after dark or keep your grass short. And Karen? She loved being the boss of it. She walked around Pinewood Hills like she owned every house, every tree, every blade of grass. Her chin was always up high, and her voice was loud enough to scare the birds away. If you saw her coming, you knew she was about to tell someone what to do. Karen lived in a big house 2 doors down from Jake. Her yard had fancy flowers, red ones, yellow ones, even some purple ones. She had a mailbox painted gold, just to show off. And her car? It was a shiny red SUV. Big and loud, just like her. She drove it everywhere, even if she was just going to the end of the street. That car was her crown. She loved it more than anything. And she parked it wherever she wanted, like she was the only person who mattered. Jake, on the other hand, was the opposite. He lived in his little white house with the red door. He didn't care about fancy stuff. His car was small and gray, nothing special. His yard was plain, just grass and a few bushes. He didn't need gold mailboxes or loud engines. He liked things quiet and simple. But that driveway of his? That was his pride and joy. He swept it every weekend. He made sure it stayed clean and neat. It was his spot, his little corner of Pinewood Hills. And he didn't like anyone messing with it. So, one day, something wild happened. Karen decided Jake's driveway wasn't his anymore. Nope. She made up her mind that it was hers now. It was a sunny afternoon, and Jake was inside his house, reading a book. He heard that loud rumble again, Karen's SUV. He didn't think much of it at first. She was always driving around, making noise. But then it got quiet. Too quiet. Jake put down his book and peeked out the window. His eyes got big. His heart started thumping. There it was, Karen's shiny red SUV, parked right in the middle of his driveway. It wasn't even parked nicely. It wasn't off to the side or halfway on the street. No way. It was smack dab in the center, taking up all the space. Jake's little gray car was stuck in the garage, blocked in like a prisoner. He couldn't move it. He couldn't even get out. That big red SUV sat there, bold as day, like it was saying, "This is my spot now, Jake. Deal with it." Jake took a deep breath. He didn't want to get mad. Not yet. He told himself maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Karen didn't mean to park there. Maybe she'd move it soon. He put on his sneakers and walked outside. The sun was warm, but his hands felt cold. He stood by the driveway and stared at that car. It looked so wrong there. His driveway was small, just big enough for his one car. Now it was taken over. Stolen. By Karen. He looked around for her. She wasn't far. She was standing in her yard, watering those fancy flowers. Her big sunglasses were on, and she was humming a song like nothing was wrong. Jake walked over. His stomach felt twisty, but he kept his voice calm. He didn't want a fight. He just wanted his driveway back. "Hi, Karen," he said, standing a few steps away. She didn't look up right away. She kept watering her flowers, letting the hose spray everywhere. Finally, she turned her head. "What, Jake?" she said, like he was a kid bugging her. Jake pointed at his driveway. Your car, it's in my spot. Could you move it, please?" Karen stopped watering. She put one hand on her hip and stared at him. Then she laughed. A big, loud laugh that echoed down the street. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was mean. "Oh, Jake," she said, shaking her head like he was silly. "This is a community, Jake. We share things here. Learn to share." Jake blinked. Share. His driveway wasn't something to share. It was his. He owned it. He worked hard for it. He didn't park his car in her yard or take her stuff. Why should she take his? But Karen didn't wait for him to say anything. She turned back to her flowers and kept watering, like he wasn't even worth her time. Jake stood there. His face got hot. His hands balled up into fists, but he didn't yell. He didn't stomp his feet. That wasn't Jake. He just smiled a little, tight smile, and nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. Then he turned around and walked back to his house. His sneakers dragged a little on the pavement. He could still hear Karen humming behind him. But inside? Oh, inside, Jake was boiling. His chest felt tight, like a pot of water about to bubble over. He wasn't mad because of the car, not just that. He was mad because of how Karen acted. She laughed at him. She talked to him like he was nothing. Like he didn't matter. Jake wasn't loud or bossy like her, but he wasn't a doormat either. He had feelings. He had pride. And Karen? She just stomped all over both. He sat on his porch and stared at that red SUV. It looked so smug, sitting there in his spot. The sun bounced off its shiny hood, almost blinding him. He thought about what she said. Learn to share. Those words stuck in his head, spinning around like a song he couldn't stop hearing. Share. No way. This wasn't sharing. This was taking. This was Karen saying she could do whatever she wanted, and Jake just had to take it. The more he thought about it, the madder he got. He remembered other times Karen acted like this. Like when she told Mr. Lopez across the street his dog barked too much even though her music was louder. Or when she made Mrs. Carter, no relation to Jake, pay a fine for painting her fence blue, even though the rulebook didn't say anything about colors. Karen made rules up as she went. She pushed people around because she could. And now she'd picked Jake to mess with. But here's the thing, Karen didn't know Jake. Not really. She saw a quiet guy in a plain t-shirt and thought he was weak. She thought he'd just sit there and let her win. She thought wrong. Jake wasn't loud, but he wasn't a pushover. That smile he gave her? That nod? It wasn't him giving up. It was him deciding something. Something big. Inside his head, Jake was making a plan. He didn't know exactly what he'd do yet, but he knew one thing for sure: Karen had just started a fight she wasn't ready for. She thought she was the queen, but Jake? He was the quiet knight, waiting for the right moment. She didn't know it yet, but she'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. That red SUV in his driveway? It was the first move in a game she was going to lose. Jake leaned back on his porch and crossed his arms. He looked at that car one more time. His smile got a little bigger, not a happy smile, but a sneaky one. Karen could laugh all she wanted. She could park there today. But tomorrow? Tomorrow was going to be different. Because Jake wasn't just boiling inside anymore. He was ready to do something about it. Days went by after that sunny Saturday when Karen first parked her shiny red SUV in Jake's driveway. And guess what? She didn't move it. Not the next day. Not the day after that. She kept parking there. Every single day. It was like she'd decided Jake's driveway was her new home for that big, loud car. Every morning, Jake would peek out his window and see it sitting there, bold as ever, blocking his little gray car in the garage. Every evening, it was still there, shiny and smug, like it was laughing at him. Karen didn't just park there and leave it alone, though. Oh no. She made it a show. When Jake walked outside to get his mail or sweep his porch, she'd be there, watching. She'd lean against her SUV, her arms crossed, and smirk at him. A big, mean smirk, like she'd won some huge game and Jake was the loser. "Morning, Jake," she'd say in a fake sweet voice, flipping her blonde hair. Or sometimes, "Nice day, huh?" All while standing right next to her car in his spot. It was her way of saying, "I'm in charge, and you can't do anything about it." Jake didn't say much back. He'd just nod or give a little wave. "Yeah, nice day," he'd mumble, then keep walking. But that smirk? That voice? It made his stomach twist. He didn't like it. Not one bit. Neighbors saw it, too. They'd peek out their windows or whisper to each other when Karen wasn't around. "She's parking in Jake's driveway again," they'd say. Poor Jake. But did they tell Karen to stop? Nope. Not a single one. They were scared of her. Karen was the queen of the HOA, after all. She made the rules. She could make their lives hard if they crossed her. So they stayed quiet, and Jake stayed quiet, too. Too quiet. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. He might have looked calm on the outside, but inside. He was watching. Watching everything. He started paying attention to Karen like he never had before. He saw how she bossed everyone around, not just him. She'd yell at Mr. Lopez if his dog barked once. "Keep that mutt quiet," she'd snap, even though her own music was way louder. She'd march up to Mrs. Carter's house and point at her blue fence. "That's against the rules," she'd say, even though no one could find that rule in the HOA book. Karen didn't care about real rules. She made stuff up to feel big. And then Jake noticed something else. Karen didn't even follow her own rules. She'd leave her trash cans out on the street all week, even though the HOA said to put them away by Monday night. One time, Jake saw her dragging them out late, clanging and banging, not caring who she woke up. Another night, she blasted music from her house, loud pop songs that shook the windows way past midnight. The HOA rule said no noise after 10, but Karen didn't care. She did what she wanted, when she wanted. And nobody stopped her. Jake started keeping track. Not with a big notebook or anything fancy, just in his head. Every time Karen broke a rule or acted mean, he remembered it. Trash cans out? Check. Loud music? Check. Bossing people around? Double check. He didn't know why he was doing it at first. It just felt right. Like he was collecting little pieces of a puzzle. A puzzle about Karen. A puzzle he might use later. Days turned into weeks. That red SUV stayed in his driveway, and Karen's smirks got bigger. Jake's neighbors kept whispering, but still, no one said a word to her face. Jake didn't either. He'd walk past her, nod, and keep going. Too quiet, like always. But something was changing. Jake wasn't just mad anymore. He was thinking. Planning. Watching her every move. One evening, the sun was going down, painting the sky orange and pink. Jake was on his porch, sipping lemonade. He liked lemonade, it was cool and sweet, and it made him feel calm. But then he heard it. Karen's voice. Loud and sharp, cutting through the quiet. He looked over and saw her across the street, yelling at Mr. Lopez again. "Your stupid dog is barking too much," she shouted, waving her arms. Mr. Lopez mumbled something and went inside, his head down. Karen laughed, proud of herself, and walked back to her house. Jake watched her go. That smirk was on her face again. He took a sip of his lemonade, but it didn't taste as good this time. His eyes slid over to her red SUV, still parked in his driveway. Something clicked in his head. He put down his glass and pulled his phone out of his pocket. It was just a regular phone, nothing fancy, but it had a camera. Jake stood up, walked to the edge of his porch, and looked at that car. Then he lifted his phone and snapped a picture. Click. The screen showed the SUV, clear as day, sitting right where it shouldn't be. He looked at the picture. It was perfect. You could see his house in the background, his garage with his little gray car trapped inside. Proof. He swiped to take another one. Click. This time, he zoomed in a little, getting the license plate. Click. One more, just to be sure. 3 pictures, all showing Karen's car in his spot. Jake smiled a tiny, sneaky smile. Not a happy one, but a smart one. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy yelling at someone else now, poor Mrs. Carter, about her fence again. Her voice carried across the street, loud and bossy. Jake slipped his phone back into his pocket and sat down. He picked up his lemonade and took another sip. It tasted better now. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do with those pictures yet, but he knew they were important. Like the first step in a secret plan. The next day, Karen parked there again. Smirked again. Jake nodded again. But he watched her closer. That night, she left her trash cans out way past Monday. Jake saw it from his window. He didn't take a picture this time, but he remembered. Another piece for his puzzle. A few days later, she blasted music again. Jake heard it through his walls, thumping and booming until almost 1 in the morning. He didn't sleep much that night, but he didn't mind. He just added it to his list. Little by little, Jake was figuring her out. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could do anything, park in his driveway, break rules, boss everyone around and get away with it. She thought Jake was just a quiet guy who'd never fight back. But she was wrong. Every smirk, every rude word, every time she broke her own rules, Jake was watching. Collecting. Waiting. Those pictures on his phone? They were just the start. What was Jake up to? Why was he so quiet? What was he planning? You'll see soon. Because Karen didn't know it, but every day she parked there, every time she laughed at him, she was digging herself a bigger hole. Jake wasn't loud. He wasn't fast. But he was smart. And he was ready to make her wish she'd never messed with him. A week passed since Jake started snapping those sneaky pictures of Karen's red SUV in his driveway. Things in Pinewood Hills felt the same on the outside, quiet streets, kids riding bikes, birds chirping. But something big was coming. Something nobody saw coming, especially not Karen. The neighborhood was about to get a huge surprise, and it all happened at the HOA meeting. The HOA, that's the Homeowners Association, liked to have meetings every month. They'd get together in the clubhouse, a little building at the end of the street with wooden walls and a big table inside. Everyone in Pinewood Hills had to go, or at least they felt like they did. Karen ran those meetings like she was the queen of the world. She'd stand up front, telling people what to do, making new rules, and acting like everyone else was just there to listen. Neighbors didn't like it, but they didn't argue. They'd just sip their coffee and nod, scared to make her mad. So, on that Saturday night, the clubhouse was full. Chairs were lined up in rows, creaking every time someone sat down. The air smelled like coffee and cookies. Mrs. Carter always brought some to share. People chatted in low voices, waiting for the meeting to start. Karen was there, of course. She stood near the front, flipping her blonde hair and adjusting her big sunglasses, even though it was dark outside. She looked smug, like always. Her arms were crossed, and she had that mean little smirk on her face, the one she gave Jake every day when she parked in his driveway. She was ready to run the show, just like she always did. Everyone sat down. Mr. Lopez was there, sipping his coffee fast like he was nervous. Mrs. Carter passed out her cookies, smiling but keeping her head down. Other neighbors shuffled in, filling the chairs. They all knew Karen would start talking soon, bossing them around, telling them what they were doing wrong. It was the same old thing. They were used to it. But tonight? Tonight was going to be different. The room got quiet. Karen stepped up to the front, her high heels clicking on the floor. She cleared her throat, ready to start. "Okay, everyone," she said, her voice loud and sharp. "Let's get this meeting going. We've got a lot to talk about." She started listing stuff: new rules about trash cans, something about no bikes on the sidewalk. People nodded, but you could tell they weren't happy. They just didn't want to fight her. Then the door opened. Everyone turned to look. It was Jake. He walked in, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look scared. He looked different. His brown hair was neat, and he wore a plain blue shirt, but there was something about him. He stood taller. His eyes were bright. He wasn't the quiet, shy Jake they all knew. He was calm. He was confident. And under his arm, he carried a fat folder, stuffed with papers. Karen saw him and rolled her eyes. "Oh, great," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What do you want, Jake?" "Sit down. We're busy." She waved her hand like he was a bug she wanted to shoo away. A few people giggled, but most just watched. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. Something big was in the air. Jake didn't sit down. He didn't even look at Karen's smirk. He walked right past her, straight to the front of the room. Everyone's eyes got wide. Karen's mouth opened a little, like she couldn't believe it. Jake stopped next to the big table, turned to face the crowd, and put his folder down with a soft thud. The room went super quiet. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Tick. 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 "Hi, everyone," Jake said. His voice was steady, not loud or shaky. Just clear. "I've got something to share." He looked around, meeting people's eyes. Mr. Lopez stopped sipping his coffee. Mrs. Carter put down her cookie. Even the nosy old lady in the back leaned forward. Karen crossed her arms tighter, her smirk turning into a frown. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "This is my meeting." Jake didn't answer her. He just opened his folder. Inside were papers, lots of them. He pulled out a stack and started passing them out. "Take one and pass it along," he said. People grabbed the sheets, confused but curious. The papers rustled as they went from hand to hand. Jake kept going, handing out more. The room buzzed with little whispers. "What's this?" someone asked. "Look at this," said another. Karen stomped over. "What is this nonsense?" she yelled, snatching a paper from Mr. Lopez. She looked at it, and her face changed. Her eyes got big. Her mouth dropped open. The paper shook in her hand. Jake kept passing out his stack, calm as ever. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He just let the papers do the talking. What were they? Pictures. Lots of pictures. The first one showed Karen's shiny red SUV parked in Jake's driveway. Clear as day, his house in the back, his garage blocked. Another picture zoomed in on her license plate. More showed the same thing, day after day. Then there were other papers, screenshots from Jake's phone. One showed Karen's trash can sitting out on Wednesday, even though the rule said Monday night. Another had a timestamp of her loud music at midnight, way past the HOA's quiet time. Page after page, Jake had proof. Proof that Karen wasn't just parking in his spot. She was breaking her own rules, too. The room got louder. People gasped. "Look at this," Mrs. Carter said, holding up a picture. "She fined me for my fence, but her trash cans are out." Mr. Lopez nodded. "And that music, she kept my dog awake." The whispers turned into chatter. Everyone was looking at the papers, pointing, talking. Karen's face turned redder than her SUV. Her sunglasses slid down her nose, and she pushed them back up, trying to look tough. But she didn't. She looked mad. And scared. Jake wasn't done. He pulled out one last paper from his folder. It was different, not a picture, but a letter. It had a fancy city logo on top. He held it up so everyone could see. "This," he said, "is from the city. It says my driveway is mine. My property. Not Karen's. Not the HOA's. Mine. He put the letter down and looked right at Karen. You can't park there. It's not yours to take. The room went dead silent. No whispers. No gasps. Just quiet. You could hear Karen breathing hard, her chest going up and down fast. Her face was so red it looked like a tomato. She threw the paper she was holding on the floor and shouted, "What is this? What are you doing, Jake? This is ridiculous." Jake turned to her. He didn't yell back. He didn't even frown. He just smiled a small, calm smile. "Oh, didn't I mention," he said. His voice was steady, like he was talking about the weather. "I'm a lawyer. And I've been building a case against you for months." A lawyer? The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Everyone's mouths dropped open. Mr. Lopez spilled his coffee. Mrs. Carter's cookie fell on the floor. Karen froze, her hand stuck in the air. A lawyer? Jake. Quiet little Jake, who swept his driveway and never made a fuss. He was a lawyer? The neighbors looked at each other, then back at him. It was like they were seeing him for the first time. Karen shook her head. "No way," she said, her voice loud but shaky. "You're lying. You're not a lawyer. You're just Jake." She pointed at him, her finger wobbling. Jake didn't flinch. He reached into his folder again and pulled out one more thing, a card. A business card. It had his name on it, Jake Carter, attorney at law. He held it up, then set it on the table. "I don't talk about it much," he said. "I like keeping things simple. But you, Karen. You pushed me too far." The room exploded. Not with noise, but with shock. People stared at the card, then at the pictures, then at Jake. Karen's red face went pale. Her smirk was gone. Her big, bossy voice was gone. She looked small, standing there, her arms dropping to her sides. Jake had done it. He'd flipped everything upside down. The quiet guy nobody noticed. He'd just taken down the queen. The clubhouse was buzzing after Jake dropped his big surprise. The crowd gasped all at once, like they'd seen a magic trick. Mouths hung open. Eyes got wide. Mr. Lopez's coffee cup shook in his hand, and Mrs. Carter clutched her cookie plate like it might fly away. Karen stood there, her face redder than a fire truck, her big sunglasses slipping down her nose. She looked mad. She looked scared. And for the first time ever, she didn't look like the Queen of Pinewood Hills. Karen tried to argue. "This is stupid," she shouted, waving her arms. "You can't do this, Jake. Those pictures don't mean anything. That letter, it's fake." Her voice was loud, but it wobbled, like she wasn't so sure of herself anymore. She pointed at the papers on the table, the pictures of her SUV in Jake's driveway, the screenshots of her breaking rules, the letter from the city. "You're lying," she yelled. "You're not a lawyer. You're just making this up." But Jake didn't back down. He stayed calm, standing there with his fat folder. He didn't yell or get mad. He just kept going. "Oh, I've got more," he said, his voice steady and clear. He reached into his folder and pulled out another stack of papers. The room got quiet again, everyone leaning forward to see. Jake held up one sheet. "This," he said, "is from 2 years ago. Karen fined Mr. Lopez $50 because she said his dog barked too much. But there's no rule about that in the HOA book." Mr. Lopez nodded fast, his eyes big. "That's right," he said. "I paid it, but I didn't want to." Jake put that paper down and grabbed another. "And this," he said, "is from last summer. Karen told Mrs. Carter her blue fence broke the rules. She made her pay $100 to fix it. But guess what? There's no rule about fence colors either." Mrs. Carter gasped. "I knew it," she said, her voice shaky. "I painted it white, but I liked the blue." The crowd started whispering. Jake kept going, pulling out more papers. "Here's one where Karen left her trash cans out for a whole week. And here's another where she parked her SUV on the street overnight against her own rule. Oh, and this one? She threw a loud party last year, way past midnight. The HOA says no noise after 10, but Karen didn't care." He laid the papers out on the table, one by one, like a trail of proof. Every sheet showed something: Karen bullying neighbors, making up fines, ignoring the rules she forced on everyone else. People couldn't believe it. "She fined me for my flowers," said the old lady in the back. "She said they were too tall." Another neighbor waved a picture. "Look. Her music woke me up 3 times." The whispers turned into loud talking. Everyone was mad now, flipping through the papers Jake gave them. Karen's face went from red to white. She looked around, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. "Stop it," she yelled. "This is my meeting. You can't talk like this." But the neighbors weren't listening to her anymore. Jake had shown them the truth. He stood there, quiet and strong, letting them see it all. Then Mr. Lopez stood up. "I've had enough," he said. "Karen's been bossing us around for years. She makes up rules and breaks them herself. I say we vote her out right now." The room exploded with noise. "Yeah," shouted Mrs. Carter. "She's a bully. Vote her out," called someone else. Hands shot up in the air. Almost every single person raised their hand, even the quiet ones who never said a word at meetings. Karen's mouth dropped open. "You can't do that," she screeched. "I'm the president. I run the HOA." But Jake shook his head. "Not anymore," he said. He pulled out one last paper: the HOA rules. "It says right here, if most people vote, we can pick a new president. And look around, Karen. Most people are voting." He held up the rule book, showing everyone. The hands stayed up. The vote was clear. Karen stomped her foot. "This is ridiculous," she yelled. Her sunglasses fell off and hit the floor with a clack. She didn't even pick them up. She grabbed her purse, turned around, and stormed out of the clubhouse. The door slammed behind her, bang, so loud it made the windows shake. Everyone watched her go. For a second, it was quiet. Then someone started clapping. Slow at first, then faster. More people joined in. Soon, the whole room was clapping, loud and happy, like they just won a big game. Jake didn't say anything. He just closed his folder and stepped back. The clapping was for him. The quiet guy they'd ignored. He'd just taken down the neighborhood tyrant. Karen was gone, and they all knew it was because of Jake. The next morning, Jake woke up early, like always. He made his peanut butter sandwich and looked out his window. His jaw dropped. The red SUV? It was gone. For the first time in weeks, his driveway was empty. Just his little gray car sat there, free at last. He stepped outside, still in his pajamas, and stared. No shiny red monster. No Karen. Just his clean, neat driveway, all his again. He smiled, a real smile this time, not a sneaky one. Later that day, he went for a walk. Something funny happened. Neighbors didn't just wave at him anymore. They clapped. Mr. Lopez saw him and clapped from his porch. "Good job, Jake," he called. Mrs. Carter ran out with a cookie. "You're a hero," she said, handing it to him. Even the old lady in the back waved from her window and clapped her wrinkly hands. Everywhere Jake went, people smiled and clapped. It was like he was famous now. Jake didn't expect that. He didn't do it for clapping or cookies. He just wanted his driveway back. He wanted Karen to stop being mean. But now, everyone saw him differently. The quiet guy they used to pass by without a second look, he was the one who stood up to the bully. He was the one who fixed things. Karen didn't come back to the HOA meetings after that. Someone said she was selling her house, packing up her fancy flowers and her gold mailbox. Her red SUV didn't show up in Jake's driveway or anywhere else in Pinewood Hills. She was gone for good, and nobody missed her. The new HOA president was Mrs. Carter. She didn't make up rules or boss people around. She just asked everyone to be nice and share cookies sometimes. People liked that a lot better. Jake went back to his regular life after that. He swept his driveway on weekends, like always. He drank lemonade on his porch and watched the birds. He didn't talk about being a lawyer much. He didn't need to. Everyone knew now he was the guy who quietly watched, quietly planned, and quietly won. He didn't gloat or brag. That wasn't Jake. He just did what he had to do, then went back to being himself. But there was one big difference. People didn't mess with him anymore. If someone parked too close to his driveway, they moved it fast when they saw him coming. If a kid's ball rolled into his yard, they said sorry right away. Everyone in Pinewood Hills learned something that night at the clubhouse. Jake might be quiet, but he was strong. He wasn't someone you could push around. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood felt different. Calmer. Happier. No more fake fines or loud music at midnight. No more Karen stomping around like she owned everything. Jake's driveway stayed his, and that was that. He'd sit outside sometimes, looking at it, and feel good. Not proud in a loud way, just happy it was over. The neighbors never forgot what he did. Sometimes, when he walked by, they'd still clap just a little, like a secret thank you. Jake would wave and keep going. He didn't need the clapping. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed his driveway, his quiet life, and a little peace. And now, he had it all. So here's the thing, friends, sometimes the person who says the least has the most to say. Think about that for a second. Jake was quiet. He didn't yell or brag or make a big fuss. He didn't walk around Pinewood Hills acting like he was the boss of everyone. Nope. He was just Jake, sweeping his driveway, sipping lemonade, keeping to himself. But that didn't mean he was weak. Oh no. It meant he was smart. It meant he was waiting. And when the time was right, he showed everyone what he could do. Karen didn't get that. She thought she could push Jake around because he didn't talk back. She saw him nod and smile when she parked her big red SUV in his driveway, and she thought, ha. He's nothing. I can do whatever I want. She laughed in his face. She smirked at him every day. She acted like he was small, like he didn't matter. But she was so wrong. She never saw him coming. She never thought the quiet guy with the plain t-shirt could turn everything upside down. And that's what made it so awesome when he did. Jake didn't need to be loud to win. He didn't need to shout or fight or make a big scene. He used his brain instead. He watched Karen. He took pictures. He found proof. He waited until the perfect moment, that big HOA meeting, and then bam. He showed everyone who she really was. He didn't just take back his driveway. He took away her power. He made the neighborhood better for everyone. And he did it all without raising his voice. How cool is that? So, what about you? Ever surprised someone who thought you couldn't do something? Maybe you're quiet like Jake. Maybe people look at you and think, oh, they're not loud, so they're not strong. But you know that's not true, right? You've got stuff inside you, ideas, plans, strength that nobody sees until you're ready to show it. Maybe it's at school, when someone says you can't win a game, but then you score the winning point. Or maybe it's at home, when your big brother thinks he's the boss, but you figure out a way to fix something he can't. Those moments. They're your Jake moments. They're when you surprise everyone, just like he surprised Karen. Let's think about Karen for a minute. She was loud. She was bossy. She walked around like she owned the whole world. She thought being big and noisy made her better than everyone else. But it didn't. It just made her mean. And in the end, it made her lose. All that yelling and smirking didn't help her when Jake showed up with his folder full of proof. She thought she was the queen, but she forgot something important. Being loud doesn't make you right. Being mean doesn't make you win. It's what you do, not what you say, that counts. Jake showed us that. He didn't talk a lot, but he did a lot. He watched. He planned. He stood up when it mattered. And when he did, everyone saw him, the real him. Not just the quiet guy with the little house, but the guy who could change things. The guy who could make the bully go away. That's the secret, friends. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the strongest. You just have to be smart and brave when it's time. What if Jake hadn't done anything? What if he just let Karen keep parking there? His driveway would still be hers. She'd still be bossing everyone around. The neighbors would still be scared and mad. Nothing would have changed. But Jake didn't let that happen. He decided to fight back, not with fists or yelling, but with his brain. He took a chance. He stood up. And because of that, everything got better. That's what makes this story so great. It's not just about a driveway. It's about saying, nope, I'm not letting you push me around anymore. It's about taking back what's yours. So, Think about your life. Is there a Karen out there pushing you around? Maybe not with a car in your driveway, but with words or mean looks. Maybe someone at school who thinks they're better than you. Or someone who laughs when you try something new. What would Jake do? He'd watch. He'd wait. And then he'd show them they were wrong. You can do that, too. You don't have to be loud or mean back. You can be quiet and strong, just like him. You can surprise them with what you've got inside. Here's a fun question for you: what's your secret power? Jake's was being a lawyer, but yours could be anything. Maybe you're really good at drawing, and nobody knows it yet. Maybe you can run super fast, but you haven't raced anyone. Maybe you're great at making people laugh, even if you're shy. Whatever it is, it's yours. It's special. And when the time's right, you can use it to surprise everyone just like Jake did. Let me tell you a little story. Once, there was a kid named Sam. Sam was quiet, like Jake. He didn't talk much in class. The other kids thought he was boring. One day, a big kid named Max started picking on him. Max would take Sam's pencil or push his books off the desk, laughing like it was a game. Sam didn't yell or cry. He just picked up his stuff and kept going. But one day, there was a school contest to build something cool out of paper and tape. Max bragged he'd win. Everyone thought he would, too. He was loud and sure of himself. But Sam? He worked quietly. He folded paper, taped it just right, and made a little plane that flew across the whole room. Max's fell apart. Sam won. The kids clapped, and Max's jaw dropped. Sam didn't say much, but he didn't have to. He showed them. That's what Jake did. That's what you can do. You don't need to be the loudest or the biggest. You just need to be you, your best you. Karen underestimated Jake, and it was her biggest mistake. Don't let anyone underestimate you. Keep your eyes open. Keep your ideas ready. And when it's time, show them what you've got. So, friends, what do you think? Ever had a moment where you surprised someone who didn't expect much from you? Maybe you aced a test they thought you'd fail. Maybe you helped a friend when no one thought you could. Tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your stories. Jake's not the only hero out there, you are, too. Share your Jake moment with me. Let's cheer for each other. And hey, if you liked this story, give it a big thumbs up. It's fun to see Jake take down Karen, right? We've got more stories like this: people standing up, surprises popping out, bullies getting what they deserve. Hit that thumbs up button if you want more. It tells me you're having fun, and I love knowing that. We're a team here, you and me, finding cool stories together. Before I go, here's one last thing to think about. The world's full of Karens, people who think they can push others around. But it's also full of Jakes, people who don't give up, who fight back in their own way. You're a Jake. I know it. You've got strength inside you, even if it's quiet right now. So keep being you. Keep watching. Keep waiting for your moment. Because when it comes, you're going to shine just like Jake did. See you next time, friends. Stay awesome. Stay strong. And don't let anyone park in your driveway unless you say it's okay.